Imagine a continent bombed to rubble, starving, frozen, terrified of a return to war. Now imagine one superpower arrives with food, dollars, machines, and a story. We saved you. We rebuilt you. And the real danger isn't us. It's Moscow. That's the world the Marshall Plan built. Now listen to this excerpt from Ben Steil, author of The Marshall Plan, Dawn of the Cold War, 2018.
In fact, the integration of Europe economically and militarily had actually been a central component of the new geostrategy of containment fathered by the great American diplomat George Kennan, and that's very much lost today. The fact that European integration was such a central feature of what we today call the Marshall Plan.
In this episode, we're not asking whether the Marshall Plan worked. It clearly did. We're asking a harder question. Did it also hardwire a way of thinking where the United States equals protection and Russia equals permanent threat? And is that mental map still steering Europe's choices in Ukraine today? After World War II, much of Western Europe was shattered. Factories destroyed, railways broken, food shortages everywhere. The U.S. State Department's own historical office describes how the European Recovery Program, what we call the Marshall Plan, pumped about $13 billion between 1948 and 1952 into Western Europe. This is roughly $130+ billion in today's money. The official goals was to rebuild industry and agriculture, stop political collapse, and contain the spread of communism. By 1951, the economies of the participating countries had not only recovered, they realized a total output of at least 35% higher than in 1938, just before the war, according to post-war economic reviews of the program. So yes, on the surface, the story is simple. America paid. Europe rebuilt. Everyone cheers. But if you look under the hood, you see two other objectives baked into the design. The first is political alignment. The Marshall Plan wasn't offered only as food and tractors. It came with conditions. Countries had to accept market-oriented reforms, cooperate economically with their neighbors, and keep communist parties out of power. This is not to suggest that liberal capitalism was or is a better option to communism. It only suggests the rivalry that existed and still exists between the two socio-economic, cultural, and political ideologies, a discussion for another day. U.S. officials at the time were very open about this. Internal memoranda talked about preventing a collapse to the left and ensuring that Western Europe remained part of a liberal capitalist camp. This relates to the second objective baked into the Marshall Plan design, which was strategic division. The plan was formally open to all European states, including those under Soviet influence, but Moscow saw the attached conditions as a Trojan horse. The Soviet Union rejected participation in 1947 and pressured Eastern European governments to do the same, calling it dollar imperialism. That decision, historians say, helped lock in the divide between East and West into what Churchill had already called the Iron Curtain. So from the very beginning, the Marshall Plan was not just about rebuilding Europe. It was about deciding Europe's future. It set a precedent that European security would be defined not in European capitals, but in Washington and Moscow, a framing that still echoes today. Some countries would be inside a US-led system, rebuilt with American money, open to American trade, and backed by American military power. Others would be outside, pulled into the Soviet sphere, cut off from that aid, and defined as the other side. Within a decade, this economic divide had fused with military alliances, shaping the Cold War map we still recognize today. The same American leadership and money that underwrote the Marshall Plan also underwrote NATO. As one study of NATO's origins notes, U.S. policymakers saw economic recovery and military alliance as two pillars of a single Euro-Atlantic project. This meant prosperous capitalist democracies, tied tightly to Washington, facing an increasingly suspicious and authoritarian Soviet bloc. British historian Tony Judt later wrote that the Marshall Plan embedded American interests into a fragile and sickly European subcontinent, and helped produce a Western Europe that was both financially revived and strategically aligned with Washington. In other words, money built loyalty, and loyalty eventually built an alliance. But money and tanks weren't the only tools. There was also culture. During the early Cold War, U.S. intelligence agencies secretly funded magazines, conferences, and intellectual networks. The initiatives included the Congress for Cultural Freedom, influential journals, and public exhibitions. All were designed to project an image of the West as free, creative, and modern. At the same time, they portrayed the Soviet Union as repressive, backward, and dangerous. Journalist-historian Francis Stoner Saunders has shown how the CIA quietly funded this cultural Cold War to shape European opinion. On top of that came U.S.-backed broadcasters such as Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. They sent anti-Soviet messages into both Eastern and Western Europe. Put together with economic aid and military guarantees, these broadcasts created a constant drumbeat. The message was simple: trust Washington, fear Moscow. So by the 1950s, the Marshall Plan wasn't just something you could measure in dollars. It had morphed into a story. America saved us from chaos. America rebuilt our economy. America stands between us and Russia. That story sank deep into European political culture. Now fast forward. Russia today is not the Soviet Union of 1948. The Warsaw Pact no longer exists. But the way of thinking shaped in that era still matters. You can see it when NATO leaders declare, as they did in their 2022 strategic concept, that the Russian Federation is the most significant and direct threat to allies' security and to peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. Here is where the liberation lens needs to do what it does best: separate real threat from inherited narrative. First, the real threat. Some critical analysts who oppose NATO expansion posit that recent Russian actions carry weight beyond mere narrative. In 2014, a pro-Russian government in Kiev was ousted. Moscow saw this as a Western-backed rupture of its sphere of influence. Then it annexed Crimea. It justified the move with historical claims, strategic concerns, and the need to protect its majority Russian-speaking population. Further, it supported separatist movements in Donbas, framing this involvement as defending Russian-speaking communities against a hostile Kiev regime. In 2022, Russia declared war on Ukraine on the basis of preemptive response to NATO's eastward expansion and Ukraine's growing ties with the West. Within its rights, Moscow portrayed these developments as an existential threat. Russia has also modernized its nuclear arsenal and staged large-scale military exercises, simulating conflict with NATO. Analysts at institutes like RAND treat these actions not as propaganda, but as part of a real security dilemma. These, they say, justify why Eastern Europeans fear Russia today. Their concerns are not just rooted in echoes of Cold War memory. They are responses to a decade of escalation, territorial revision, and military mobilization seen as a sustained challenge to the post-Cold War order. But now, the other side of the ledger. Ask this: why do many European elites, especially in NATO and EU capitals, treat every Russian move as part of a story that ends with eternal enemy? Why do American actions around the world rarely get framed in the same existential way? When the United States invades Iraq, bombs Libya, arms dictators, or imposes harsh sanctions, it is usually called a policy debate. But when Russia acts brutally in Georgia or Ukraine, it is often described as proof of its timeless barbarism. Part of that is simple power politics. Part of it may be genuine fear in countries that suffered under Soviet domination. But part of it comes from a story architecture built in the Marshall Plan era and never fully dismantled. Economically, Western Europe's miracle was linked to U.S. credit, markets, and investment. Militarily, its safety was tied to U.S. bases, nuclear umbrellas, and NATO command. Culturally, the West defined its identity around freedom and the Soviet identity around unfreedom. When a relationship gives you prosperity, protection, and a flattering mirror, it also gives you a bias. You become predisposed to see your patron's rival as the villain. You don't need a CIA memo to keep believing that story. It's baked into your institutions, your media, your political language. That's what people casually call brainwashing. In academic language, it's the successful construction of a strategic narrative. So did the Marshall Plan brainwash Europe about Russia? Here's the Liberation Lens answer. Visualize this as a bundle, like a cable TV package where you can't get HBO without also paying for the sports channel. The Marshall Plan bundled rebuilding plus alignment plus anti-Soviet narrative, and Europe accepted the whole package. Therefore, it didn't hypnotize an innocent continent into loving America and hating Moscow overnight. What it did was lock in a package deal: dollars plus food plus factories, NATO plus US troops, culture plus media plus freedom branding, all woven together around one simple axis. The West equals security and progress. The East equals danger and delay. Then, for decades, both sides behaved in ways that reinforced that frame. The US funded coups and interventions in the global South, but also underwrote Western Europe's stability and integration. The Soviet Union crushed uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, built the Berlin Wall, and imposed one-party rule, confirming the worst Western fears. After 1991, when a different path was possible, NATO expanded eastward, and Russia under Putin used nationalism to claw back influence, reconfirming the old pattern. So by the time we get to Ukraine, the grooves are already deep. When Russia crosses Ukraine's borders, Western leaders reach for the same story their grandparents heard under the Marshall Plan. We are defending order and freedom. They are the eternal threat from the East. And because that narrative was built with money, institutions, and media, it feels like common sense, not a political choice. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Two things can be true at once. Truth number one: Russia's war on Ukraine is brutal and dangerous, especially for smaller states near its borders. Truth number two: the way Europe and America talk about Russia today is still shaped by a 75-year-old narrative born in the age of the Marshall Plan in 1948, when aid, allegiance, and anti-Soviet messaging came as a single package. If you ignore the first truth, you slip into apologetics for brutality. If you ignore the second truth, you become a loyal echo of someone else's strategy. Liberation Lens refuses both options. We're not here to swap one propaganda for another. We're here to ask, who built the stories we live inside? How do money, fear, and gratitude shape which threats we take for granted and which we never question? And most of all, what would European security look like if it wasn't always defined in Washington, Moscow, or any other distant capital? Because until Europe and the global South can remember their history without inherited scripts, every new crisis will be framed the same old way. One side defending freedom, the other side the eternal enemy, and the rest of the world expected to clap on cue. If you want to step outside that script, not to deny danger, but to actually understand it, you're in the right place. This is Liberation Lens. And in a world built on old stories, perspective is power.